Oh boy. Today's Ancient DOS game is Double Dragon, one of the numerous ports of the hit arcade game which gobbled up many a quarter in the mid-80s. However, this port is not good. Well, it's not terrible if we go by 80s standards. I mean, by today's standards, yes, this is garbage and you shouldn't play it. But by 80s standards, the game is faithful but significantly flawed, especially compared to other DOS games of the time. I think my biggest disappointment with this particular port of the game is that it was rushed out before it was fully tested and fully functional. The simple fact that there's no EGA title screen but plenty of space on the discs to have one should be evidence enough of this, as the title screen only renders in CGA. There's also very little audio in the game, and nothing special for Tandy users even though Tandy graphics are supported. And the PC speaker sounds, well, they actually work better in Tandy mode than in EGA mode for whatever reason. I actually captured all the footage in EGA mode before I realized Tandy mode ran slightly better and had slightly better audio. Not a lot better, but it's noticeable. Still, this doesn't forgive some of the bizarre quirks and other issues that we're going to be diving into. Double Dragon was ported from its original arcade version to just about every computer and gaming console imaginable at the time, which has made it extraordinarily difficult to figure out which companies were involved to what extent in regards to the DOS version's development. But the box of the game makes mention of Technos Japan, Tradewest, Mastertronic, and Arcadia. And I really have no idea which company did what when it came to this DOS port. But at the very least, we know it came out in 1988. It's a 1 to 2 player beat-em-up game, which is a genre we don't actually often see on the show. And it has support for CGA 4-color, Tandy 16-color, and EGA 16-color graphics, but only PC speaker sound effects, which again, sound better in Tandy mode for whatever reason. As for its current release date, it's still commercial, and I was pretty much unable to find any copies of this to properly gauge its rarity or value. Though I did find a loose 3.5-inch disc of the game out on eBay for about $10, so yeah, this is going to be a tough one to find if you're building a collection, but as you're going to see soon enough, actually trying to play this thing, that's another story altogether. First of all, let's get something out of the way which bugged me right from the moment I started playing this. I'm playing a white dude beating up a bunch of black dudes. So I immediately had to ask myself, were the designers being racist, or were they just not paying attention to how their EGA color choices might be perceived? Well, given that the black dudes are white dudes when you play in CGA mode, I'm gonna say the latter. Besides, even in the EGA mode, there's white people to fight, and heck, the Abobos also show up in both white and black varieties, and even a green one for some reason. Kinda makes me want to bust out the frozen peas and corn. But with that out of the way, let's go over the basics. The game is 5 levels long, and in each level the goal is to beat up everyone with an assortment of martial arts moves. One of the things which made the game unique for the time was that you didn't have just a single punch move and a single kick move at your disposal. You have many different moves, including elbowing people behind you, getting them into chokeholds and throwing them, headbutting them, or even jump kicks to move quickly through the air while taking out enemies. Another thing you can do is pick up weapons to use against your opponents. Now, some of these you can carry around and use multiple times, like whips and bats. Some can be thrown, like knives and barrels. Plus there's dynamite, which will explode once it stays on the ground for too long. Ironically though, this port of the game only has 1 piece of dynamite in the entire thing. And it starts out on the ground even, meaning it explodes entirely on its own after a moment, and chances are you're never going to get to use it. The one thing which is kind of odd about the weapons is that in some of the ports of this game, notably the NES port, once you've cleared out specific clusters of enemies, the special weapons disappear so that you can't carry them into the next section. Now, this may have been done for sprite memory reasons, I would imagine, but neither the original arcade game nor this DOS port do this. This means if you find a bat near the start of a level, for instance, you can keep it for pretty much the entire level. You're going to need every boost you can get too, as the game doesn't quite play fair. Even the arcade game was like this, but in the arcade game, if you lost all your lives, you just toss in another quarter and keep playing. Here, you get 5 continues. No more, no less, and once they're gone, you start over from the beginning. Now, one example of the game being unfair is there's no post-hit invincibility. Sort of. If you get knocked down, you'll spend a moment getting back up, but the instant you're back up, you're vulnerable to damage. So depending on what kind of enemies you're fighting, you could end up being locked into a kill cycle if you're unlucky. Now, you can do the same thing to the enemies though, if you can either master the elbow move or get the timing down with the baseball bat. Not the whip though. The whip is supposed to knock enemies down just like the bat, but here in the DOS port it doesn't, so it ends up being almost completely worthless. One other thing to keep note of is the timer at the top. Basically, if this time limit runs out, you lose a life and then it resets back to where it started. Time limits like these are simply holdovers from the arcade machines and weren't ever meant to be a mechanic to enhance gameplay. As I believe I've mentioned before, arcade games are designed to have some sort of game mechanic which makes it impossible for the game to stay in an active state if the player or players abandon a game in progress, ultimately ending the game and returning to the attract mode. Now, many games opted to simply have a timer, but some games got more creative with this, such as with invincible enemies like Evil Otto in Berserk or Baron von Blubba in Bubble Bobble. Or some games do a check for a game state which shouldn't happen if people are actually playing, such as how Mortal Kombat will immediately give both players a game over during a two-player match if the match times out with both players at maximum health, regardless of the round number. Now, so far, this game isn't anything too terrible. The graphics are all kinds of dithered, but they're otherwise decent, and there isn't any music at all, which sucks, given that Double Dragon had some pretty iconic and memorable tunes, but there's one major thing this game did wrong. I mean, apart from the last boss being freaking impossible because his gun insta-hits you for massive damage no matter where you are on the screen, and I lost 3 freaking continues trying to beat this guy, and yeah, the controls in the DOS port of Double Dragon are not good, to say the least. I've played worse, but I've also played better for this time period. Let's start with the actual layout of the controls, as this is kind of amusing to me as a gamer in North America, but this might not surprise anyone at all from a European country. Instead of using the arrow keys, player 1 uses Q and A to move up and down, O and P to move left and right, and spacebar is the attack button. Now, if this were a fighting game with special moves, these controls would be unacceptable. But here, the controls don't do anything so tricky that you can't adapt to them. Player 2, however, kinda got shafted something fierce. They use the numeric keypad, but their attack button is right in the middle on the 5 key. Yeah, player 2's controls are way more awkward. Now, despite any of this, some of you might already be confused and might be shouting at the screen, "There's 2 attack buttons!" And yes, that's true of the arcade game and some of the ports. The DOS port, however, was designed only to use one joystick button, despite the fact that many computers by this point were either sporting 2-button joysticks or were compatible with them, so forcing a 1-button layout kinda makes things odd. Basically, every move in the game has been mapped to either pressing the attack button alone for punches, or attack with a direction for a special move, depending on which way you were facing. It mostly works. One part where it fails is that you kick by holding in the direction you're facing and pressing the attack button. But if you're close to an enemy, you may chokehold them instead, as this is how you would do it if you were using a punch button. So that might throw off some veteran players. Those are all minor issues though. The absolute worst aspect of the controls is that they miss keystrokes. The game is clearly using its own custom keyboard handler and overriding the default BIOS handler, but instead of using interrupts to capture and record keystrokes as they happen, the game instead simply scans the state of the keyboard once per frame and compares that to its previous state. That's why the game will miss brief changes happening faster than the frame rate, making it very difficult to properly perform punches and kicks in rapid succession. Not to mention, makes the elbow and back kick moves very difficult to perform consistently, since the timing needs to be frame perfect. Admittedly, writing keyboard handlers wasn't easy back in the days of DOS, and even now it still isn't for anyone not versed in how these things work, but even the joystick controls are suffering from this problem too. Actually, there is one more odd thing going on here, and this is something that Commodore 64 owners are going to be familiar with. You use joystick port 2 for player 1, and joystick port 1 for player 2. This makes configuring DOSBox to use the game's native joystick support kind of a pain, but at least it's doable. Again though, the joystick suffers the same missed inputs issue the keyboard does, so don't expect the game to play any better this way. Overall, the DOS port of Double Dragon isn't terrible, but it's incomplete. It's a big piece, but still only a piece of the full experience of the arcade original. It's worth playing for sake of nostalgia and worth owning for sake of collecting, but otherwise not really worth going back to if you actually want to enjoy playing the original game. If you want to do that, there are far better ports, such as the one on the NES. Although, other than that though, you really don't have a lot of options. For a time, the original arcade version was available to play on Xbox Live Arcade, but it's long since been delisted. There's also a trilogy release for modern hardware, but I'm told it's broken in many ways and only looks like the original arcade games without actually playing like them. The Double Dragon is a series which had a strong start, but has never found a major revival, as every attempt to do so has always fallen flat in some way, either by being poorly ported, poorly designed, or both. It'd be good to see this series make a significant comeback someday, but it hasn't happened yet. So for now, stick with the better retro versions, and just give the newer ones, and this old DOS one, a pass. Technically, all you need to do is set cycles to a very low fixed value. To get the exact game speed you've been watching, you run the EGA mode with a cycles count of 450. However, I would instead recommend switching over to Tandy mode and running with a cycles count of 350, as this plays a little better, though the flaws I've mentioned are still an issue. Joystick controls also work without extra configuration, but you are definitely going to need to remap them given how it's swapping the first and second player around. Anywho, that's all for this episode of Ancient DOS Games. Episode 229 is going to be on Saturday, February 10th, and we're going to be taking a look at a game which basically plays like The Legend of Zelda, but with robots and machine guns. Now, if you think you know of a game like that, and for DOS of all things, then be sure to send your guess to adg@pixelships.com, and stay tuned because even I have no idea what to expect with this one. Thanks for watching, everyone, and extra special thanks to those of you supporting me on Patreon. Here's just a small sample of you guys.